And to continue in that same vein, it's my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Dr. Jabraan Pasha. Dr. Pasha's married to one of the best young women architects in the city and great friends of ours. But I saw Dr. Pasha at a Clear House community education, and he was speaking about this topic, and it's so thought-provoking. I keep thinking about it as it goes along. So this is a two-part series. So for those of you who have friends that aren't here today, be sure and tell them to watch what Hank is filming so they'll be prepared to hear what Jabraan has to say next week. He is a Booker T. Washington kid. He's a Kansas University. I'm sorry. I said state because I was thinking about Arkansas. Sorry, Jabraan. Kansas. He did his residency down at Mayo in Arizona, which was fantastic. He's been at St. John for many years. He's took care of my family with such love when he was there. And now he's with Juno Health. He's National Vice President of Health Equity. So please help me welcome Dr. Jabraan Pasha.
Thanks, man. All right. Good morning. Can you guys hear me? Sounds like you can. Thanks for welcoming me here, and thanks to Connie for the invitation and for always being a wonderful mentor to my wife. She just loves you to death. So when Connie called and asked, she said, "Hey, would you come talk to the group?" And she said, "Hey, we've got about 45 minutes for you to talk if you'd be willing to do so. You know, I don't know how much we can pay you, but we could pay you something." And I said, "Let's make a deal." I said, "If you can allow me to come for 2 sessions in a row, don't worry about paying me anything." And I don't say that to say, "Oh, I didn't want your money," because I would have loved your money. But I wanted to give ourselves some time to get to know each other. And it's really hard to do that in 45 minutes. And the topics that we're going to talk about, they are challenging topics. And so I wanted to spend some time and develop some rapport. And so that's why I campaigned for 2 sessions. And so we'll be together this Sunday and next Sunday. And I hope that we all, including myself, will find value in the time that we'll get to spend with each other over the next couple of weekends. So I'm gonna just dive right into it because I don't want to miss out on opportunities for us to share some experiences and talk with each other. So we're going to talk about implicit bias. And what I would say, just kind of overarching, is that this topic, which you may have heard about, you may have not, but if you've heard about it, you've heard about it from either one or two perspectives. You've heard about it from someone who is saying we have to talk about implicit bias because it is really important and we have to learn how to manage our implicit biases. That's one perspective you may have heard, right? The other perspective is the perspective that says we should not be talking about this at all, right? And I bet about half of you or more have heard it from that perspective. And the reason that is I think there's some big misconceptions about what this conversation is actually about, right? And it's been politicized. And so what I want to do is I want to just take a step back and take some time to actually help us all understand what these conversations are truly about. And I can tell you from the beginning that conversations about implicit bias are not and should not be about pointing fingers at someone and making them feel ashamed or guilty about having biases. Because the simple truth is that we all have them. Even the person up here talking about implicit bias who does this for a living struggles with his own implicit biases every single day, right? And so this conversation shouldn't be about passing blame or shaming others, okay? And if we can understand that we all have them, right? And we don't need to feel ashamed or guilty of them, that removes a really significant barrier to constructive conversations. And that's what I hope to do. I think I can do that over 2 Sundays with you all, okay? We'll have some other things that I will hope to achieve. That'll just be an added bonus. But if I can help us understand that bias is not something that we need to feel ashamed or guilty of, I would call this a success. So that's gonna be my big goal with us this morning. And in order for us to have these really difficult conversations, actually I'm going to skip through this and come back to it because I want to share this cartoon first. Okay, so I get a lot of my content just from randomly searching the internet, and this is one of those that came up. And when I saw it, it reminded me of two things. The first was it reminded me of childhood. And my older brother, he's 4 years older than I am, we shared a room for most of our childhood. And you can imagine what two little boys' room looked like, right? You can also imagine if we had a mother who was a clean freak, and she was and continues to be so, what she would say when she'd walk in and see our room, right? It wasn't godly, I promise. And so mom would come in, she'd say some things, paraphrase, clean your room up, please. And she'd leave, and we'd do that. And we clean our room up by pushing everything into the closet, literally sweeping everything under the rug, right? Mom would come in, and she would not agree that the room was clean, right? The other thing that this cartoon reminds me of is how, as a society, we have faced difficult conversations and really challenging social issues forever, right? We've effectively swept them under the rug. It's out of sight, it's out of mind, and it's a whole lot easier to go on with our lives when we don't have to face it, right? But I will say that now more than ever, as communities and as society, we're starting to peel the rugs back. We know that what lies beneath the rug is not going to be easy to look at, it's not going to be easy to talk about, it's not going to be easy to face. But despite that, we are peeling the rug back more and more, right? And so when we have a gathering like this, the challengers, that's what you're doing. You are making a decision to peel this rug back, right? And start to face some of these difficult conversations and these tough social issues, right? So whenever someone's willing to do that, I truly believe you should be able to give yourself a little pat on the back because it's not easy to do and not everyone is willing to do it. So thank you all for being willing to peel the rug back. So as we kind of move into the content today, I think a really gentle reminder that everything we are doing really, because it's so hard and it requires you to kind of have some perspective seeking, you have to find ways to put yourself in other folks' shoes to really feel the impact of these sorts of things. The only way that that's going to work is if we let empathy guide the way, right? And in order for us to feel empathy, we have to somehow be able to, even just a little bit, put ourselves in someone else's shoes, right? And I've always found that the best way to put ourselves in that position to be able to do that is to do what I call a little bit of a privilege exploration. And what I mean by that is taking a step back to reflect on your own privileges, right? And we'll do a little bit of that, right? Because when we talk about privilege, you've all heard the term white privilege or rich privilege, or there's also so many different kinds of privileges. That's another thing that I think has gotten maybe some misconceptions. Because again, that also should not be about shaming people for privileges that they have had, and folks should not feel ashamed about the privileges that they've had. What they should, though, is understand that with the privileges that we all have, and we all have some sorts of privileges, it has helped us become successful, right? It doesn't mean we didn't work hard, doesn't mean we didn't deserve it, but the privileges that we've had have helped us become successful compared to folks who maybe have not had those privileges. It has been a bit of a barrier for them. So what I'm going to do, because I won't ask you to do something I won't do myself, all right, is I'm going to walk you through my own kind of privilege exploration, right, and talk about the things that have helped me, the privileges that I have had that have undoubtedly helped me be successful, okay? So I'm going to look through a lot of this in my own life so you can understand what I mean by just taking a look at our own privileges, okay? So this is Jabraan's privilege exploration. So I was fortunate enough to live and grow up in a stable two-parent household, right? My parents have been married for, 50-something years. I never saw any sorts of violence domestically. I saw two parents that loved each other. A lot of people don't have that. And I know that the fact that I lived in a stable two-parent home put me in an advantage in certain situations, right? I never went to bed hungry. My family was not well off, but I never knew that because I had food in my belly whenever I needed it, right? And so when I went to school, I was able to focus and concentrate. I didn't have hunger pains or low on energy because I didn't get the nutrition that I needed at home, right? A lot of kids do not have that. We had stable housing. We didn't live in a big house, but we lived in a house. We lived in 3 homes my entire life. From the time I was born to when I turned 18, we only lived in 3 different homes. And that stability definitely benefited me. One of my parents had a college degree. My mom has a degree in education. And the data shows that if you have one parent who has a college degree, your chances of getting a college degree goes up significantly, right? So that was a privilege that I had. I had access to quality schools. In most cases, they were public schools. I went to Mayo, Carver, and Booker T. And that shaped me in a lot of ways. And not every kid in our community has access to that high quality of education. And it shows when we start to look at some of the disparities that exist across town. As an adult, my privileges they're through the roof now, all right? And it's important for me to reflect on that. I live in a neighborhood, and some of you I know live in Midtown Tulsa, and I know in my neighborhood, I can count that there is a Walmart neighborhood market, there's a Reese's, there's a Whole Foods, there's a Trader Joe's, and a mile and a half, they're all in Peoria, and a mile and a half from each other, right? And knowing that in my neighborhood I have access to that much in terms of fresh and healthy foods when others don't is something that can't go unmentioned. I'm a physician, so I have a very stable job. I am a man in this society, and there are things that, as a man, I don't have to worry about that women do, right? And that's a significant privilege. Being heterosexual, that's a significant privilege for me as well, right? I don't have any disabilities, and my native language is English, right? All of that is privilege. And it has undoubtedly contributed to the opportunities that I've had and success. And so what I would ask of you all as we, plan on coming back together next week is sometime this week, just take a few minutes and go through these certain areas and think about the ways that you've been privileged. And I think that will help you find the empathy that is needed to kind of push us forward as the challengers that we are, because these conversations, they're not going to get any easier. I know Connie and the team has some difficult stuff lined up, but that's a good thing. But this will help you be ready to have those tough conversations. So we'll just get moving. All right, I want to start with this. I want to see how well this shows up. Yeah, let's do it. I got it. Okay, so we see this. Yeah, that looks good. We see this picture here, and your brain is going to tell you a couple things right off the bat. It's going to say, hey, I see some horizontal lines on this page, green, blue, and red, and especially for the people who are a little further away, your brain is also going to tell you see how many different colored circles. Most people see 3, especially those in the back, right? If you get a little closer, it maybe doesn't work out as well, but that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to tell you that, hey, there are 3 different colored circles. There's a purplish blue one, a reddish orange, and a greenish yellow, right? But if we change the perspective and start to zoom in a bit, can we maybe see that really they're all the same shade of beige? These circles are actually the exact same color.
They look like eggs to me.
Yeah, you call them what you want. Easter's coming, right? We can call them eggs. But they're all the same color, right? And so it was nothing but an optical illusion. So wrap your brain around that. Come to terms with the fact that, hey, they are indeed, and they are the same color, okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to zoom back out. And although you know that they're the same color, does it make it any easier to convince your brain of that? It probably doesn't, right? And the reason I share this with you is because this is kind of analogous to dealing with implicit biases and stereotypes and associations, because oftentimes it is much easier to convince your brain of something that isn't true than it is of something that is actually true. And it takes work. It takes mental effort to really reconcile those differences at times. And so it's just a reminder that things aren't always as they seem to be, and your first mind can often be wrong. And it's important to challenge that first mind. And this will make a little bit more sense as we move forward here. So what is implicit bias? It goes by several different names. A couple of those here: unconscious bias is something that you'll hear pretty often. Maybe smarter or at least fancier people than me use the term implicit social cognition. You'll also hear the term unintentional bias, which I like. I think that really defines it really well. And essentially what it is when we have attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. And it's that unconscious that is the challenge, right? Because you're telling someone that although you are unaware of these thoughts, they can still impact the decisions you make. And that does something to us. And there's actually a term for it. It's called cognitive dissonance. And what that is when your intentions and your actions don't line up, right? That means it makes you feel really uncomfortable. And when you understand that your intentions and actions aren't lining up, you're going to do whatever you need to do to get out of that discomfort. So one way is to say, hey, I don't believe in implicit bias. It's not real. My intentions and actions always line up. And you've reconciled that, right? And so you feel better, you're going about your day, right? The other way to do it, and the way that I'm going to challenge us all to do it, is to say, okay, let's say there are times where my intentions and my actions don't line up. What can I do to better reconcile that, right? And my answer is to lean into these concepts and these things that we're going to be talking about, and other speakers that you all are going to be talking to. All of that is going to help you better reconcile your intentions with your actions, so you can do the good things that you are intending to do more often. Other things that we know, and this is a really important slide. We know that this is an uncomfortable conversation. It's just uncomfortable. It is. And I would never stand in front of a group and say, oh, it's not that bad, get over it. No, I actually would say the opposite. It is hard, right? Please lean into that discomfort, right? You'll be better for it, I promise. I think it's also important to say it's not just about race. We're going to talk a lot about race, and I would argue rightfully so. But there are a lot of groups in our societies that are at a disadvantage because of our collective implicit biases. It's important to try to give attention to as much of those groups as possible. We can't cover them all in the short time we have together, but it's important to recognize there are a lot of groups that are impacted by implicit bias. And then what I would say is the most important bullet point here, and maybe the most important bullet point of this whole two weekends together, it's the fact that implicit bias is not the same thing as explicit racism or explicit sexism or ageism or other forms of discrimination. They are inherently different because, at least for this situation, your intentions do matter. Okay? I make it a point to really hammer home this, because if I'm going to stand up here and say we don't need to feel ashamed or guilty about the implicit biases we have, this has to be the case, right? And I truly believe it, and I start off every session making this point. It's important to also say not everybody agrees with me. And I can remember this was pre-pandemic, so this was several years ago. I was in Portland, and I was doing a session for a group of physicians, which I imagine there may be one or two physicians in this room. They are the hardest group to talk to about this stuff with, just for whatever reason. And there was a guy in the back right-hand corner where that's generally where the trouble comes from. There's a back right-hand corner. Yeah, I know, man, I know. I always just take note of who's in the back right-hand corner. Yes, yeah. That's a good one. You got me there. And so this guy in the back right-hand corner, he took issue with me saying they were different. He disagreed, and disagreement is good, actually. I welcome disagreement. It leads to good conversation. And so we just talked about it, right? And, 90 seconds in, it was pretty clear that we weren't going to agree, which is also okay. But it kept going on. And it kept going on. And I was uncomfortable because I could see everybody else was uncomfortable except for him. And we finally were able to just agree to disagree. Can we move on, please? Yes. So we laid that down and then finished the session and went okay, I think. And I get back to the hotel and I get an email that reads, "I don't know if you remember me, but." I'm like, yeah, it was 20 minutes ago, man. I remember you. I actually learned something from him. It is as important as it is for me to say implicit bias is different from explicit forms of discrimination. It is also important for me to explicitly state at this moment that although it is inherently different, the impact of implicit bias, in my opinion, actually, is greater than the impact of explicit forms of discrimination today in 2023. And I am not, by any means, saying that implicit bias doesn't have a significant impact. It does, and we probably won't get to it till next week, but we'll talk about those impacts in some pretty detailed ways. And so I just want to be clear that although implicit bias is different, I'm not minimizing the impact of implicit bias, and that's why we're here, because that impact is so real. That's why it's important to talk about it. So the whole idea of implicit bias kind of hinges on this concept known as mental association. The other way of referring to it is mental glue. And essentially what that means is when mental association exists, it allows tasks and decisions to be made with less effort, right? It's mindless, it's automatic, right? When mental association doesn't exist, it requires more mental effort. It requires more work. It is just more difficult. It takes more time, okay? And this will make sense because we'll do an activity here. That really helps us understand when we have biases, how we can make those split decisions, right? When we don't, and it takes a little bit more time, right? And you work through it a little bit more. So we'll do an activity. And in order for us to do that, we have to clear our minds a bit. So this is not easy to do, but let's try to just take a second, close your eyes if you wish, to try to just have a blank slate. And what we're going to do is I'm going to show you some pictures, so eventually you open your eyes again. And I'm going to ask you to take note of the very first thoughts that come to your minds when you see these pictures, okay? And I'm going to ask you some questions, and then take note of the answers that come to your mind when you first hear those questions, right? That's the easy part. The hard part is being willing to share those thoughts with the group, okay? So get ready. Start to build up some of that courage, because it does take some, we're peeling the rugs back, remember? It does take some courage. So I'm going to start you off with a very easy one. This won't take much courage at all. So what I want you to do is tell me what's going on in this picture. There's no tricks. We got somebody running, right? And you knew it before I even asked the question, right? How did you know it? How did everyone in this room know exactly what was going on in this picture? So based on our past experiences, we see someone who's dressed like this, and maybe they're out exercising, right? Absolutely. She's on a track, right? Exactly. So based on our past experiences, we see someone in that setting wearing clothes like this. It's just pattern recognition, right? Mental shortcuts. That helped. What else helped?
An empty audience. There's no audience there, so she's just practicing.
Yeah, there's no crowd. She's just out exercising. Absolutely. What else? The track.
She's obviously fit.
Yeah. Yeah, she's fit. She looks like someone that works out. She's literally striding, right? So you put, what's that?
Her foot's in the air.
Yeah, right. She's clearly running, right? So you put all that together without actually realizing you put it together, right? It wasn't necessarily sequential. You didn't have to go from dot to dot. It all happened almost immediately But that led us there, and you all knew it before I asked the question that this is a lady running, right? That's that mental association, right? Effortlessly, right? So now what we're gonna do is, I still haven't gotten Anna to Photoshop this for me yet, so you're gonna have to use your imagination. We're going to move this young lady from the track to a neighborhood like this, okay? This reminds me of, some of the homes in Philbrook neighborhood. It's just random internet mansion. I just Googled it, but we can all imagine what neighborhoods that have homes like this look like, right? So now I want you to imagine her jogging, not on the track, but in this neighborhood, okay? This is where it starts to get challenging, okay? So what I'm gonna ask you is, when you see this lady jogging in this neighborhood, what are the things that come to mind about who she is? What does she do? What is she into? What are the thoughts that come to your mind?
She could be the cleaning lady.
Okay, she could be the cleaning lady. So we laugh, but we get that comment all the time, right? Because for some of us, and I would admittedly say I probably fall in this as well, we don't associate a lady who looks like this, who is as young as she is, as being what we would, call the breadwinner for a family that lives in a home like this. That's maybe some of our associations. Thank you for sharing that. What else came to mind?
I went just the opposite. The young professionals I know
Yeah.
are out running.
Okay, right. So based on your association, you see someone like this who's fit, who's young and female. She's got a pretty well-paying job, and she's a young professional. Right, great. What else? There's no wrong answers here. Yes, ma'am.
She doesn't necessarily live in the neighborhood, but likes to exercise and look at the home.
That comes up a lot as well, right? She feels safe there, right? She just likes to cut through to look at these homes and imagine what it may be like to live there. That comes up too. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
It depends on what day it is.
Okay, it's Tuesday afternoon. So what's your answer now?
I would think that she is
Just say it.
wife.
Just say it. Yeah. Okay. So I will say, this is not exaggeration. I've literally given this session over 150 times. And over 150 times, someone has said that she is a woman who works inside the home. And 149 times, it's come from, oftentimes, a woman who works outside of the home. And it's not to say the guys don't think that. They're just not brave enough to say it out loud, right? So that comes up a lot, too. What else? Anything else on her?
I want to see the car. I think she drives a BMW.
Okay, yeah. So kind of the best one that I've ever heard is, she looks like a lady who loves brunch. So with that, we'll move on to the new character. So now I want you to imagine we've got this guy here. And just like she was, he's running around in that neighborhood. So what's coming to your minds when you... Yeah, so as quickly as we said, she probably belongs. We don't question why she's there. We see this guy and we're saying, well, wait a minute, right? What are you doing here, right? Many of us, not all of us, but many of us, I would say that just doesn't quite fit with my past experiences of what someone looks like who lives in a neighborhood like that, right? Yeah, that's talk about cognitive dissonance, right? It's hard to reconcile that. And if I were to say, well, actually, this guy, he's one of the top neurosurgeons in town. Like I don't have the capacity to wrap my brain around that, right? Because of the associations and past experiences, right? So the point of this exercise, and thank you all so much for participating in it.
It's important to say he's not comfortable there.
He might not be.
He wants to be away from that.
Yeah. And Mark, to be honest, I found myself feeling that way before.
Well, so have I.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the point.
Mhm.
Turn that right around.
Yeah.
We've all been
Mm-hmm.
in neighborhoods we don't feel
Yep, absolutely.
I know more if I knew about the tummy.
Well, I've tried to work through this. I want to say it says luck, but it could say anything that rhymes with luck. I don't know. I don't know. But that's a fair question. That's a fair question. So the point of this is to remind us of how easy it is for us to come up with these thoughts. I asked you to do it. I'm so glad you were willing to. But we do this every single day, all day long. Right? It's just the way that our brains work. It's not a bad thing. But what I hope that this activity does for us is just helps us realize it. Because once we realize that we do it, then we can start to pay attention to what some of those thoughts are, and then we can start to maybe attach them to some associations or biases that we have. And then we can better recognize what some of our biases are, right? So this is just it's a reminder. It's kind of fun, right? It's okay to laugh, but it's a reminder of how we do this in the real world. And so remember that the next time you walk by, someone in the hallway or someone on the street or someone at the grocery store, and you have this thought, just challenge it a bit. Just challenge it a bit. Right? So I'm gonna use this, and I'll walk through. Usually we'll do an activity on paper, but it probably doesn't make sense for today. But I'll tell you about it. So here there are two things that across cultures there are very strong associations for. We've got flowers, and across cultures, most folks have really positive associations with flowers, right? When the weather's nice, as I hope that it's going to be soon, the flowers are blooming, right? Birthdays, holidays, we tend to get or give flowers, like positive association with flowers, right? And then bugs, right? Most of us, almost all of us, have really negative association with bugs, right? Spend a lot of money to keep them out of our houses, and we shy away from them. So because of these consistent associations, a group out of Harvard put together something that's called the Implicit Association Test. And they used these consistent associations as kind of a control for this test. The short of the long is that what they were able to do was based on the speed of which people could connect things. They could say, yes, this person has a positive bias for flowers and a negative bias for bugs, right? And 98% of people who took this activity had a positive bias for flowers and a negative bias for bugs, right? And so they said, okay, we've confirmed this. This test works in uncovering our biases, or confirming our biases is probably a better word. And so once they set this up, this was way back in 1994, they said, well, if we can test for biases of flowers and insects, why can't we test for biases of other more socially charged characteristics, like religion or race or age, right, or gender or sexuality? And to develop this implicit association test, and now literally tens and tens of millions of people have taken it. And so we have this data bank that shows that bias, implicit bias, right, unintentional bias, exists in really large numbers all over the world. And next Sunday, I'll provide you guys with a website, and you can actually take some of these tests on your own. So some of the data. Of the folks that took an implicit association test that looked at a person's bias for or against black and white folks, showed that 70%, and this is well over 3.5 million people at this point, 70% had an implicit, so unintentional, positive bias for whites, and that means that 70% had a relative negative bias against blacks. A similar test was done about same-sex couples, and it showed that 65% had a negative bias against those same-sex couples. The American Bariatric Society refers to weight bias as the last socially acceptable form of bias because it's not scrutinized in the way that other biases are, right? And because of that, it's no surprise that of the millions of folks that took the implicit association test on weight, 75% had a negative bias against individuals with obesity, right? This is a really important one given the field that I'm in. This is about gender and career. And this test showed that when someone had a bias that a math science career was a more male-oriented career, if that person was a woman, that woman was a lot less likely to have pursued a career in math and science or a math and science major. And in countries where they have large biases that math and science careers are more male-oriented careers, they actually have poor achievement from their school-age girls in math and science tests, right? And so you can see those biases impacting generations of people. So let's move on to another really wildly interesting technology that's used to look at bias. And so if that implicit association test, or IAT as it's called, is able to measure implicit bias, there's actually a technology, this is going to sound like science fiction, but it's real. There's actually a technology that can image and literally see biased thoughts in a person's brain real time, even if that person is unaware. Okay, so let me explain. So this technology is called functional MRI, and I know some of us have had MRIs in this room, right? And just like a traditional MRI looks at the structure of a body part, okay, a functional MRI actually looks at its biochemical function. And it does that by detecting increases in oxygen and blood flow in different parts of the brain. And we know that when we are using certain parts of the brain, it needs more oxygen, therefore it gets more blood flow. You can see what part of the brain someone is using by using a functional MRI machine, even if that person is unaware. So you can also use that to see emotions, because we know emotions and feelings, we know the centers of the brains that they come from, right? And so this actually results in a really good technology for studying implicit bias. And so I'll tell you about some fascinating studies that looked at fear and disgust and empathy and human recognition in someone's brain. So the first study took a group of participants and they put them in a functional MRI machine and they exposed them to imagery of things that humans are innately afraid of, okay? Pictures of snakes and spiders, those things that we have what we call like just a deep-rooted visceral reaction to when we see them, right? And they looked at the brain, the part of the brain that you may have heard of, it's called the amygdala, which is the fight or flight center of the brain. What do you think they saw when they used functional MRI to look at someone's brain when they are looking at pictures of snakes and spiders? They saw that amygdala firing. They saw it activating, right? It was telling them, you should be afraid. And so they felt a sense of fear, right? Even though it was pictures, right? They then exposed, and that's not surprising, right? That's how it should work. Then they exposed them to pictures and images of things that shouldn't necessarily spark any sort of fear response, right? But something stood out. They noticed that when some of these participants were shown pictures like this one here, pictures of young black males, there was an amygdala response that was greater than when they saw pictures of snakes and spiders and other scary things, all right? So let's apply that to some context, right? Think about that in the context of officer-involved shootings of unarmed black men and how bias may play a role in those tragedies, right? A very similar study was done and had to do with same-sex couples and bias, and this had to do with the emotion of disgust. So they took participants, they put them in a functional MRI machine, and they exposed them to stimuli that is, for most humans, disgusting, usually really strong smells. And they could see in a certain part of the brain, it's called the insula, that when they smelled something aversive, something that smelled really bad, that insula would activate, right, because they were disgusted. They then exposed them to things they shouldn't be disgusted by, including pictures of same-sex couples like this, what I would call very appropriate displays of affection. And in some of the cases, the participants had an insular response that was very similar, literally, to when they smelled rotten garbage. Right? Yeah. So let's lighten it up a bit. So if you know me, which none of you do, but maybe Connie and Mark, I'm a avid Kansas City Chiefs fan, right? So I'm doing really good right now. And so anytime I get the chance to talk about the Chiefs, I will talk about the Chiefs. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. I'm just talking about the Chiefs. But it actually makes sense here. I'll make it work, at least, right? So group membership plays a big role in our biases. And what I mean, the groups that we belong to, right? And that could be something like gender or religion or race or age or something much, much more arbitrary, right? Like who we root for on the field. Right? And so I want to tell you about a study that looked at group membership as it pertains to fanship, okay? And it's actually not football as we see here. It's football as it's known all over the world, and that means soccer here in American, right? And there was a study that was done, and it had to do with English Premier League soccer, right? Which is pretty well recognized as having the best talent for soccer in the world. And there's a team there, a club as they call it, known as Manchester United. Yes. Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, if you watch Ted Lasso, this is the league that they just got moved up to, okay? So Manchester United has been shown to have one of the largest fan bases in the world. Hundreds of millions of Manchester United fans all over the world, okay? Despite the fact that they haven't won in a very long time, okay? Let me ask a question. Does that remind you of any American football team? The Dallas Cowboys, right? So I equate Manchester United to Dallas Cowboys of soccer, right? They have big, obnoxious fan bases and they haven't won in decades, right? So in this study, they took, bias, facts. In this study, they took Manchester United fans, and they basically tricked them into being a part of this study where they said, hey, we're just going to talk about what it means to be a Manchester United fan, right? So they pulled them onto a campus, I think it was a college campus, and they interviewed them. And they asked them questions like, what's your favorite memory as a Manchester United fan? Who's your favorite player? You know, just those sorts of things really got them hyped up, okay? And then they said, okay, for the next part of this, we need to walk to a different building, right? So they walked them across the campus, and they staged the next part of this study. And the next part of the study was there was someone out jogging, and this person that was jogging runs across the Manchester United fan and the person escorting them, and they take a fall. And they're on the ground, rolling in agonizing pain, okay? The variable here was the jersey that person was wearing. Yeah. So they were either wearing a Manchester United jersey or a rival Liverpool jersey, okay? And what they were studying was, does the jersey that person is wearing impact the likelihood that Manchester United fan is going to offer aid? And you know what the answer is. They were more likely to get down and help the person who was wearing a Manchester United jersey than they were the person who was wearing the rival Liverpool jersey, right? And as a Chiefs fan, and then, you know, I think about the Raiders, who are probably our biggest rivals, even though they haven't been good in a long time. I can see that, right? It's like not that surprising, but if something as arbitrary as who you root for on a football field or a soccer field can impact that empathy, think about other factors and how big of a impact that can have, right? And so group membership is a big, big part of that. And lastly, the last study I want to talk about has to do with what the research refers to as extreme outgroup members. And that would be folks who are experiencing homelessness, people who are struggling with intravenous drug use or substance use, right? Those are folks that have traditionally and continue to be kind of shunned by society, right? So they looked at brains of everyday people, and they noticed that when they are interacting with other everyday people, there's literally a center in the brain known as the human recognition center. And when you are interacting with other humans, that center is activating. Like, hey, there's other people around, right? Social engagement with other people. But they found that when those of us who are not in that extreme outgroup category interact with people who are in that extreme outgroup category, the human recognition center in the brain literally activates less. Which may explain for me why I don't have much trouble anymore just driving by someone who's homeless, right, with the sign up. Maybe it won't even look twice at times, right? And it may be because my brain literally sees them as less human. It dehumanizes them. And I don't know if that's a survival tactic or is it to help our emotions, but the studies show that that happens, right? And so it can explain some of our behaviors and some of our treatment of people who are in this extreme outgroup category. So what we'll do, we've got a little bit of time left. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about where implicit bias comes from, okay? Because if I'm going to say, hey, we don't need to feel ashamed or guilty of it, I also have to make the case that there's nothing that we can do about it. We're going to have biases, right? So this is the part where I say, hey, there's nothing we can do about it. We're going to have some biases, right? And I'm going to do that by telling you where our biases come from, what produces the biases that each of our brains hold, okay? The first being, it's just simply about the way that our brains process information, okay? Think of our brains as 3-pound computers, okay, that have maybe the processing power of an old school Nintendo, right? Pretty decent, actually. And if you could imagine all of the information that's coming into our person at any given moment, it's a lot of data. And there is no way that we could intentionally attend to every piece of that data. There's no way. There's no way. We would not have the capacity to do that. But our brain is able to handle most of that data subconsciously, right? So it frees our conscious brain up to do the things that we need conscious attention for, right? And so that makes us really efficient, right? And in order to take care of all that data subconsciously, we have to rely on pattern recognition and mental shortcuts and connecting the dots, right? That's the only way we could possibly handle all of that data. It makes us really efficient, but there are going to be times, because it's so much data, that our brains assume it has enough information to make those decisions and take those actions, and it just doesn't. And that can result into some biased decision making. Okay? The other thing that happens is our past experiences shape our biases in a major way, maybe more than any other thing on this list. Right? If we had a past experience that was rooted in really strong emotions, then we were definitely going to hold on to that, right? And if it could produce a bias that may stay with us for the rest of our lives, right? Our brains are really good at that. What they're not so good at is separating true lived experiences that we've had from experiences that we've gathered from others. The stories that people tell, or what we see on TV or in the movies or on the news, right? We know the media plays a big role in the shaping of the biases that we have, right? We can start with the news media, right? We know that the news media is going to be more likely to represent an architect or a doctor or an engineer or a scientist as a woman, or as a man, than they are a woman, well out of proportion to how it actually plays out in that community. They overrepresent those professions as men than women, right? We know that the news media has been shown in many instances to be more likely to show a mugshot of a black suspect and withhold a mugshot of a white suspect, right? Shaping our associations of what do the criminals look like in our community, right? We know that shows like Cops and Live PD overrepresent crime committed by black and brown people and underrepresent crimes committed by white people. They also overrepresent law enforcement as white men on those shows. These studies have been done. And so that can shape our perceptions of not only who are the criminals in our communities, who are the heroes in our communities, right? So you can start to see how TV and news media and movies can shape biases in mass, right? And then the other question is, well, back in caveman days, was there a survival benefit to being wary around others, right? If caveman A found himself out hunting for food and came across a group of caveman Bs, was it more likely that if he had a fear of that other group, that it was going to get him to safety? Probably, right? And so maybe today we're left with some of those instincts, despite really probably no survival benefit. And so maybe that's where some of our propensity to have bias comes from, right? So maybe the last thing we'll do, and we'll leave some time for questions, and then we'll finish up next week, is a little bit more talk about group membership, okay? Because ultimately this plays a big role. There is a news story that was on 60 Minutes where they looked at implicit bias in babies. And they did some covering of a lab out of Yale where researchers have been studying bias in babies for years. And in this story, and maybe we'll lead into it next week. We'll start with that video because it's really interesting. So I won't spoil too much of it, but it basically showed that babies as young as 7, 8 months old have the ability to recognize differences in others, and if those are differences from them, they may be more likely to not have anything to do with that person or stuffed animal or other baby, and are more likely to favor things that remind them of themselves. It's fascinating research, and we'll show that video when we kick it off next week. So group membership is a big anchor of bias. And when we think about group membership and bias, we tend to think about large categories, right? Gender or race or age or religion, right? But as we learned with the football study, that group membership tie can be really trivial, but have still very real impacts on how we treat others, right? And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I bet we could all think of times where these categories of group membership may have impacted how you were treated or how you treated someone else, right? Even very trivial group membership ties, like the zip code you live in or the hobbies that you enjoy, right? Or the denomination that you belong to, right? And so we know that group membership is a big anchor for implicit bias. There's a children's book from Dr. Seuss known as The Sneetches. It was like 1956, I think, when it came out. And the story goes that star-bellied Sneetches have bellies with stars. Plain-bellied Sneetches have none upon theirs. You all remember that story, right? And the star-bellied Sneetches, they lived the high life. They hung out on the beach and they roasted hot dogs and just had a good time. And the plain-bellied Sneetches, they didn't have stars on their belly, right? And so one day, a guy named Professor McMonkey McBean rolls up to the Sneetch camp, and he goes to meet the plain-bellied Sneetches and says, hey, I have this machine. It's called the Star-On machine, all right? And for $2 only, you can hop in this Star-On machine without a star on your belly, and when you hop out, you'll have a star on your belly. So, of course, they shelled out $2 each. They all hopped in, and now all the plain bellies have stars on their bellies. And no one can tell the difference, right? And the original star bellies were really upset, right? So Professor rolls up to the star belly, the original star bellies, and says, hey, I have this machine. It's called the Star-Off machine, right? And for $3 only, right? And so this went back and forth until the Sneetches faced financial ruin. And it wasn't until that they realized, well, this is stupid, right? Why are we putting so much emphasis on these star bellies, these really trivial characteristics, right? So it was a story that is relevant today and probably will be relevant for forever, really. So I will leave it at that. We've got 2 minutes for any comments or questions, and if we don't get time to answer your questions today, we can answer them next week. So that's all I got today. Yeah.
I don't think it's bias, but maybe it is. My little 2-year-old grandson, when he looks at a Chinese person, he speaks Mandarin, and when he looks at a white person, he speaks English.
Yeah.
That's
It is bias, but it's not a bad thing, right? But he's learned that, right, from spending time with his grandparents,
yeah, but
right?
they're excited. I mean, they didn't know it was going to happen. like
Right,
that, 'cause they
right.
thought that he was going to speak
Right, and I say he's learned that in terms of when he's around Chinese people, most of them are going to be speaking Mandarin because of his time with his grandparents, right? And then when he's around white people, most of them are going to be speaking English, right? And so this is, again, based in his past experiences. He's got short past experiences, but it can really develop
But it's
really
biased
quickly.
because no one taught him.
It is
that.
biased, but not in a bad way, right? It's just, it is what it is, but that's a really good example
And
of
when
that.
you say bias, we shouldn't have a negative connotation.
Exactly.
Okay, thank
Yep,
you.
yep. Yes, sir.
Do you think bias, implicit bias, in today's society is worse than it was 5 years ago, or is it getting better?
I think we're talking about it more today than we were 5 years ago, and much more than we were 10 years ago. So because of that, I think maybe it's getting better, because we are starting to have these conversations. We got a long way to go, but I think we are talking about it much more, which gives me hope. Yeah, really good question. Yes, sir.
The thing I think that has helped me with mine is for me to understand I have it,
Yeah,
but for it to not have me.
I love that. I love that. He said for him, what he's been working on is understanding that he has it. He has biases, but his biases don't have him, which is a great way to put it. I've never heard that. 1 minute left. So we got one question maybe, if there's any more.
Can you put the slide up about our privilege so I can take a picture?
Yep.
I gotta work on that.
Sure
This is your homework,
can.
everybody.
Yeah, take a picture.
Take a picture, because we're gonna take a picture. We have to turn in the homework?
No, we'll talk about it though. I don't want to create too much work, but just give it some thought over the week. Yeah.
Ron, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. It was great to be here.